Well, thank you very much indeed, Stuart, Rob, Christine, Carl. We've gone through a lot. There is now some time for questions. So if you could, have we got a roving mic or not? Yes, we do. So if you could identify yourself as you ask the question, that'd be great. Over there.
Harry Robertson, City AM. You've said that both parties' plans are not properly credible, and the Resolution Foundation has said that both parties are on track to break their spending pledges. On top of this, predicting tax and spend is notoriously difficult. So is there any point in producing these kind of super detailed documents that both parties have done, and would you like to see that tradition continue?
I think it's certainly helpful to have the sort of detail that we've got. I mean, I think some of the numbers in all the manifestos are open to question. As you've heard, there are a number of things uncosted within them. But I think what you get from this is a pretty clear sense of direction from the parties. It's absolutely clear that there is a very big difference in outlook. I think one of the problems for the Conservatives, in a sense, is that because they've tied themselves to a particular fiscal rule and they don't want to say they're going to raise taxes, I think their spending commitments, in both the last elections, have not proven to be durable. And I do think, if you look at both Liberal Democrats and Labour, the fact that their current spending plans and tax plans come to almost precisely the same number tells you there's been some pretty clever and careful spreadsheet work, more than it tells you that those are actually exactly what's going to happen and what are reasonable and central estimates of what will happen. And I think that's particularly true, as you've heard, on the tax side for what Labour are saying. But also, to simply say things like we will spend an extra however many 100 billion it is on investment, or we will spend, in Lib Dem's case, an extra however much it is on childcare. It's easy to say these things. It's easy to say these things in government. I've sat in the Treasury working with these spreadsheets. Actually delivering them is much, much harder. Anything further?
Thanks. Kate Ferguson from The Sun. On your second page, I think it is, you say, one simply cannot say with confidence whether the overall effect of Labour's plans on growth would be positive or negative. Are you saying they could plunge Britain into recession there? And also, can you talk a little bit about Labour's plans in terms of intergenerational fairness? Like, they've obviously given quite a lot of money to pensioners, wealthier pensioners. How does that impact poorer, younger people?
Well, look, we might go into a recession, whoever is the next government. It's clear that if we end up with a no-deal type Brexit, which seems to be more of a risk under the Conservatives than under the other parties, that certainly creates an increased risk of a downturn. But equally, I think we can't. It's very hard to say how to offset the impact of Labour's EU policy against some really substantial changes in all the other areas that we've talked about. The issue is not so much as we've said that you cannot. Of course, you can get to an equilibrium where we have higher spending and higher taxes and more regulation than we do at the moment. But economies take time to adjust to very big changes. Whatever you might think of, the changes in the 1980s, certainly the early 1980s Conservative policies resulted in a recession at that moment and resulted in a very different kind of economy now than we had 40 years ago. Now, I'm not saying that Labour's policies would do that, but getting to a very different place can be turbulent along the way. But let me stress, we are not going to try to, and I don't think it's actually possible within normal economic models to say what the overall impact of that whole huge combination of policies would be. And if you're looking at sort of intergenerational issues, I think it is, I think as I say on here, all of the parties are saying, well, let's keep the triple lock, let's keep winter fuel payments and so on. Labour are saying, well, let's keep TV licences for the over 75s, despite the fact that we know this is a relatively well-off group. The spending on WASPI, extraordinarily, for a small group of people, is very substantially more over this Parliament than Labour is suggesting for people of working age on benefits, which is a much bigger group and a much, much poorer group who have seen very significant cuts in their benefits over the last 10 10 years. So I think one does look at this and say, well, all of the parties still seem to be focusing more on older groups than younger groups.
Daily Telegraph. You talk about millions outside that bracket of top 5% that might be affected by tax rises. Could you give any quantification of how many millions, even in a rough sense?
Stuart.
Well, I mean, how many would be affected by tax rises at all? Given that I would say that there's a good chance that corporation tax rises will result in at least some reduction in workers' wages and some increase in prices, how much is very much an open question. That would suggest, most people being affected in some way. But as I say, I mean, I'm not sure how interesting that is without actually having magnitudes attached to say, well, okay, but how many of these people would lose by how much? And that I really don't have a view on, because, we don't really know how much of corporation tax is ultimately passed on to workers or goes into prices or is felt by shareholders. We know it's a mixture of the three. And so I think I would say it is going to be pretty widely shared. It is going to be pretty progressive overall, but how much of it is outside the top 5%, I wouldn't want to put a number on. But if you're asking, how many people, then it's going to be most of us.
How many are affected by the dividend change, do you know?
Not off the top of my head, I'm afraid.
But the married tax allowance is a couple of million?
So, yeah, 1.8 million, I think, getting it last year, as far as I remember.
Yeah. But it's a substantial, we can probably find the dividend number?
Actually, we can find the capital gains, and I'm not sure whether the dividend one is split out. It may be, I can't remember.
But there are certainly substantial numbers affected directly by the dividend and capital gains tax as well. But sorry, we can't give a more precise number. Sorry,
Andrew Woodcock from The Independent. One of the graphs you showed the distributional impact on the poor and the wealthy of benefit and tax changes. It appeared that the impact from the Conservative policies was pretty much unchanged. Liberal and Labour ones both very similar trajectory of distribution to the poorer. But I was just wanting to ask, how radical a change would that actually be? Is that something that would be noticed in a big way, or is that a marginal thing?
I mean, putting it in the, I'll ask Rob in a moment, essentially putting it in the context of what's happened over the last decade, those were fairly modest changes. I mean, clearly very welcome for those in the bottom third, but nothing like undoing the cuts that they've seen. And actually, even over the last decade, we've seen some quite big increases in tax for the top 10%. And I think I'd be right in saying that Labour's changes would be no bigger than what's already been seen there. Any additions, Stuart or Rob?
That's basically what I was going to say. I mean,
Sorry.
No, that's good. The Conservative, well done. The Conservative line is just that. All that has in it is the national insurance cut, which is a small £85 a year cut for lots of people. That's all that's in there. Yeah, and if you want to look at exactly what set of reforms are actually included in those lines, it will be in the web appendix.
I mean, it is also worth repeating Stuart's point that you can't have £80 billion worth of tax rises without making most of the people on that chart worse off in some, or a large number of people on that chart worse off in some way, just a very untransparent way. I mean, 80 billion out of the economy is going to affect those people. Most of that we just can't model, and we can't know exactly where. Mostly towards the top, probably, but not all.
Chris Giles from the Financial Times. If I'm understanding you correctly, you're essentially saying the Conservatives are not credible because they won't be, that taxes will have to rise more than they're saying, and they're putting in a not credible limit on those taxes, and Labour and the Liberal Democrats are not credible because the nature of their tax increases won't raise the money and are not necessarily very effective. What does this mean for where the tax system is in 5 years' time? Does this mean that we're going to have a worse tax system than we've got? And what would a good tax system look like?
Well, that's an easy question. I mean, I think I think it's worth saying on the the not credible bit. I mean, one thing that is clear is that there are a series of things in the Conservative manifesto which they're committing to, but they've provided no funding for. And Carl ran through some of that. There's social care. There's some of the capital spending and so on. And it looks, frankly, very much like that's designed to allow them to show that debt isn't rising over time. We've seen in 2015, 2017, I mean, it is extraordinary in some ways. You go to the electorate promising, to be really horrible to them, and then actually be rather nicer in terms of public spending. And my guess is my guess, I don't know, is that that's the sort of thing that might happen again. And we have seen, the tax burden has risen very gradually over the last decade because there are other ways of raising tax. On what might happen to the tax system over time, clearly if Labour win, it will be dramatically changed. A very big increase in corporate taxes, some very welcome increases in the taxation of dividend and capital gains, which would improve it. I suspect that what would happen with corporate taxation would be an awful lot of work, an awful lot of complexity, and rather less revenue than suggested there. But I think the evening up of taxation on unearned income and earned income would be rather welcome. Where the Conservatives would get, you need to think about where else would you find additional revenue if you're tying your hands on rates of income tax, national insurance, and so on. Well, what's happened over the last decade? Big increases in the taxation of pension contributions, for example. Maybe. I'm not saying the Tories would do that, but let's see what they've done in the past. That's clearly been one element of it. They have broadened the corporate tax base so that whilst corporate tax rates have gone down, the corporate tax base has become broader. And there are all sorts of other smaller things that have happened over that period. So there's always scope to find money here and there. But did you have any additional thoughts on what might happen to the tax system, Stuart?
No, I mean, I'm not going to try and predict or I can just analyse what the parties say they want to do. I mean, just on that last point, there are certainly ways that you can raise revenue without increasing income tax, national insurance and VAT headline rates. Over the years, governments have put a lot of work into trying to do that, and that means that it's harder to do that more given what's already been done. So if you take pensions as an example, they've actually already cut the tax relief on that quite a lot. You could go further, but it gets harder. And you also may risk ending up having to go to things, having to look to places that are even less sensible from an economic point of view.
Great. Okay, lady at the back.
Ivana Stahazi, I'm a German business journalist. Just wondering, Stuart, if you could help me unpick this inclusive ownership fund. What does that actually mean for foreign corporations operating here in the UK? Firstly, how are you going to manage to put 10% of their shares into a UK fund if they're not listed here? Secondly, how relevant is it, given that a lot of them are actually working with a branch structure? Deutsche Bank, one of the biggest employers in the city of London, thousands of employees, is actually operating a branch here. So could you unpick that for me, please?
Yeah, well, I can try. As I think, as a preliminary, I'd first of all say there is devil in the detail to be worked out. And also that, Labour has actually changed in the last few weeks what its proposal for this inclusive ownership fund is in terms of how it treats international companies. It was looking at global profits, now looking at just UK profits. To take the two specific examples, how a foreign company's shares would be treated. So, as I understand the current proposal, it is only looking at the UK activity of UK companies. So if you have a foreign company with a UK subsidiary, it's only the subsidiary operating in the UK that will be relevant. Now, it may be that the shares at the moment are shares in the global parent company. What Labour says is that these would essentially be new types of shares. They wouldn't be like the shares in the overall companies. They would be new shares that only relate to the UK activity. Again, quite how that works is another matter. I certainly don't know. I don't know whether they've tried to work it out. To take your other point, the point that a lot of foreign companies operate in the UK via branches rather than subsidiaries, that's one that I mentioned. As I understand it, at the moment, if it is a foreign company operating in the UK rather than a UK subsidiary that may be a UK company that may be a subsidiary of a foreign company, it just wouldn't apply. And so I don't know. I'll take your word for it. Deutsche Bank operates with just with branches in the UK. If that's the case, as I understand it, under Labour's current plans, that just wouldn't be caught in the inclusive ownership fund, wouldn't apply to them at all. But again, I wouldn't say I'm 100% sure of that, and it's also something where, bear in mind, Labour are working something up in opposition. They don't have the full resource of the civil service. You wouldn't necessarily expect them to have worked out every last detail. It's worth bearing in mind the complexities that could arise, the difficulties that would arise. But, it might be a bit much to expect them to have a fully fledged, fully worked out, fully detailed proposal that is already, oven ready, to coin a phrase. At this stage, doing this in opposition, I think I would take it as much as a statement of intent and a direction they want to travel in. That's not necessarily to say it will be easy. It's also, not necessarily to say that the fact that it has difficulties necessarily means that it's a bad idea. There are issues about, how we deal with corporate governance, whether companies should be run just for the benefit of their shareholders, for a wider group of stakeholders, including employees and so on. And actually, thinking about these issues is not a bad thing to do, not a bad thing to raise. As I've set out their plan as I currently understand it, with lots of details still to work out, and I think there are problems, particularly in terms of how they treat multinationals in that sense. But that's not to say they couldn't do anything.
Right.
Thank you. Gavin Corden of the Press Association. You were talking about possibility of a no-deal scenario after the end of 2020, and just showing that debt and borrowing levels rising under a Conservative government in that event higher than what you're projecting under Labour at the moment. I just wonder if you could talk about the sort of policy implications. Would we see a big surge in borrowing like there was after the global crash, followed by a further bout of austerity? Can you just sort of point something in that direction? Thank you.
That would be a risk with any significant downturn, but Carl?
Yeah, so I think if there was a big downturn in the near term, you may even see giveaways from the government to try and limit the damage done by the recession. In the longer term, if there was a remaining structural problem, which there would be under a no-deal Brexit, there almost certainly would be under any other recession. They tend to reveal longer-term problems in the public finances. The government at the time would have a choice between tax rises and spending cuts. It's not unusual if you end up with a smaller economy to decide that you're going to have less to spend on public items as well as private items. So a return to austerity would be perhaps the most likely outcome, not immediately, but in the medium term.
Jason Douglas from the Wall Street Journal. Just go back to this credibility issue. One of the things that came up a few times was this idea that some of these pledges aren't deliverable. Could you just expand on that a little bit and what exactly you mean? Are we saying that past experience tells us that the sums we're talking about are simply impossible to spend, or are there particular challenges around capital spending versus current spending? What exactly are you getting at, please? Thank you.
It's a particular issue around capital spending. It's always been the case, and it was the case very significantly during the 2000s, when Labour then was increasing investment spending by nothing like the scale we're talking about here. Year on year, underspends were really very substantial. And when you're talking about what is effectively a doubling of public sector investment, the chances of that being able to happen in 1, 2, 3, or even 4 years, I think are pretty remote. Now, clearly, we could get to that level of investment over a decade if that's what we did, ramping up gradually. But if you think of the challenges here, one, you've got a government sector which is not used to delivering anything like that scale. Two, all of these things need a lot of planning, both in terms of planning permission and just planning, and that takes significant periods of time. Three, the workforce. I mean, we don't have a trained workforce to suddenly double the number of hospitals or houses or roads or whatever we're building, and presumably there's a good chance that whatever arrangement we come to with the EU, there'll be less free movement than we have at the moment. So all of those are constraints, and we have seen those constraints bite every time in the past when we've tried to really ramp up public sector investment. So I think the key here is to say, we may have an aim to get to here in a certain number of years, and here is the path that we're going to get there. The idea that you could double within 2 or 3 years, I think, is it genuinely isn't deliverable. Or if you tried, you really would risk wasting a lot of money.
And just to come in on that, Paul's spoken a lot about investment spending. You see that in some of the current spending as well. So taking childcare as an example, for one, Labour wants to double the amount of childcare. Lib Dems, we're going to see 5 times the spending. Hiring enough staff and creating enough spaces to actually make that happen over a 5-year period is tough. Even Labour, which is the more modest of the two, is planning to hire an extra 150,000 early years workers. That's about 40% increase on what we have now. Doing that in 5 years at the same time as you're trying to upskill them, at the same time as you're trying to find facilities for these kids to go into. We've seen delivery challenges in this sector before, and I think it's pretty likely that we'd see something along those lines as well.
I think that's worth saying sort of more broadly about if you're trying to nationalise a bunch of stuff, renegotiate Brexit, significantly increase the size of the state, increase investment spending, overhaul the tax system, each one of those is a big challenge. Doing all that together, it's not impossible over a long period of time, but you do need to be careful about what you're promising over a short period. So, yeah.
Hello, Martina Betts from the Daily Express. So last month, the Institute of Social Research said that Boris Johnson deal would make the country 70 billion worse off. But then since then it's been argued that that's just because of immigration, because the shrinkage of GDP is just because the levels of immigration wouldn't be so high. So the difference would just not be very much. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, we don't do our own modelling, but it is very clear that all of the modelling of the impact of leaving the EU on the sort of deal that the Prime Minister has got will leave the UK in economic terms less well off than we remained, because we'll be outside of the customs union and outside of the single market. So national income per person would be smaller. The fact there's less immigration would also mean that the whole size of the cake might be somewhat smaller, but it's not all driven in that model. It's not all driven in that model by immigration. It's also worth saying that these models have very wide ranges of uncertainty. They know the direction. I think they get those right, and they know how you're ordering between single market, Mrs May's deals, Mr Johnson's deal, and so on. But there's a lot of uncertainty about the scale of the impact, in particular because it depends whether you're just looking at the direct effects of increased costs of trade, or whether you're also looking at indirect effects that might have in terms of competition and productivity and so on. So it's not all immigration, though that can be part of the overall total. Anything further? Yeah.
Bill Schomburg from Reuters. It was just a question I had on Christine's presentation. I think, if I understood correctly, you said that even despite the big plans to increase spending on early years education, it wouldn't have a big impact on women in work and on educational development. I just wonder why that was.
Thank you for asking the question. I was really hoping someone would. This is based on a bunch of research that's been done by my colleagues at IFS and by other researchers in England, as well as research that's been done around the world. So the first thing to say is politicians often want to claim that they have a double dividend on childcare. They're going to both bring lots of women into work, and they're going to do great things for child development. international evidence says it's pretty hard to do both of those at the same time. Most countries that benefit on one see nothing or negative impacts on the other outcome. Within England, the situation is actually even potentially worse than that, in the sense that the 15-hour free entitlement program, so what's already in place for 3- and 4-year-olds, when that's been evaluated, they've found only very small impacts on children's development that fade out quite quickly, so we're not seeing a big win on those outcomes. And when we look at mother's labor supply, we see basically nothing from 15 hours, a little bit more from 30 hours of free childcare as delivered through the school system. But even so, that's only about 12,000 extra mothers in work. So it's a pretty small impact, about 3.5–4 percentage points on the baseline employment rate. So really, we don't know what's going to happen when we extend that to other age groups. There's some evidence that the younger you push the childcare, the worse it is for child development. So we might not expect to see especially big benefits from the Lib Dems proposals in those age ranges. But what we can say is that the current program as it stands doesn't seem to have delivered a lot on either of those two outcomes.
Anything on here?
I actually had a different question, but I want to ask something on childcare first. These studies that you quote that talk about the return of women at work, usually to the best of my knowledge, and I obviously don't know all the literature, look at kind of short-run effects, and a lot of the times these programs are not packed with sort of differences in paternity leave, etc., that would support women to come back to the labor market. So while these estimates are quite moderate, they're also quite limited in their ability to be relied upon to project what the impact on this childcare increases would be. My question is about corporation tax, though. I wanted to ask Stuart, to what extent do you think that unprecedentedness is a measure of radicalness? So you presented the increase in corporation tax under Labour as unprecedented for the last sort of 30 years, but is there any evidence, the economy over the last 30 years, the structure of the economy, the structure of what we mean by a firm has changed a lot. You see a rise in markups, sort of, you see a rise in market power because of the internet and platform economies. You see a rise in sort of winner-take-all economies that have a lot of externalities. So is there actually maybe an increased corporation tax of unprecedented scale is appropriate, even though it is unprecedented? Thank you.
Great question. Stuart.
Yeah, so I wouldn't want to say that unprecedented means inappropriate. I'm, pointing out where it leaves us relative to where we've been in the past, where other countries are. We can look at some of the, incentive effects that it creates, for example, and, there is good evidence that higher rates of corporation tax discourage investment. There is good evidence that it increases the bias between debt and equity finance, and so on. There are these known disadvantages of higher corporation tax. The OECD describes it as the most damaging tax for growth. Now, personally, I'd actually rather nuance that. I think a lot depends on the detail of it, and I would also say that higher corporation tax looks like a much worse idea when you're starting at a 30 or 40% corporation tax rate. The lower a tax rate is, the less benefit from reducing it further and the more potential gain. And a 17% headline rate doesn't look particularly high. I wouldn't say that you shouldn't increase it, there's no scope for that. I would point out that while the UK's headline rate is low, the UK's ungenerous by international standards in terms of the tax base, and particularly the allowances it gives for investment, and that kind of makes the UK look a slightly higher corporation tax country to start with than you'd have thought. Also, the nature of some of that narrow base would makes corporation tax more damaging than it would otherwise be, because the lack of full allowances for investment means that it discourages, that higher rates discourage investment more than they otherwise would. I also say that it's also about more than the headline rate. So I think that, for example, getting rid of the patent box is a much more defensible reform to corporation tax, much better way to raise revenue than, say, simply increasing the headline rate. I think that there are better and worse ways that you can do it. I would like to see a corporation tax structured in a way that helps to capture the excess rents created by imperfect competition and so on, while minimising the disincentive effects that it has. And for that, you need a kind of a different structure of corporation tax. I mean, maybe we can talk later about quite what that involves. So no, I wouldn't say don't do it. I'm just pointing out what some of the effects would be and where it leaves the UK by historical and international standards.
Are there any last questions? I'm sorry we have overrun, because I said we had quite a lot to say, because there was quite a lot in some of those, in some of those manifestos. Any further questions? We'll of course be available for questions afterwards. Well, thank you all for coming. And a special thank you to my colleagues. They've been working incredibly hard. We're not very happy with the Conservatives launching on Sunday, because that ruined our weekend, and I'm sure it ruined a number of your weekends as well. But it's been quite a journey getting to this point. We're very happy to take further questions, calls, and so on if you want any more details. But perhaps you could thank my fantastic colleagues.